in the sunlit tents of the St. Mary's Mead Art Fair, a scream shatters the calm. A young artist, Julian Harrow, collapses, poisoned by a sip of champagne. As whispers of murder ripple through the village, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of envy, greed, and betrayal. Was it the ambitious organizer, the spurned buyer, the venomous critic, or the jealous rival who slipped cyanide into the glass? In a world of glittering art and hidden motives, only Miss Marple can uncover the deadly truth before the killer strikes again. Chapter 1. The glittering fair. The village of St. Mary's Mead lay bathed in the amber glow of an autumn morning, its green a patchwork of russet leaves and dew-kissed grass. The annual art fair, a much-anticipated event, had transformed the tranquil common into a bustling galleries of white tents, each a stage for ambition and artistry. Canvases of every hue, sombre oils, brash acrylics, delicate watercolours vied for attention, their creators hovering like anxious parents. The air carried the scent of fresh paint, mingled with the faint sweetness of cider from a nearby stall. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace mittens clutching a worn knitting bag, moved through the crowd with the unhurried grace of one who sees more than she seems to. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind steel-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing. The flutter of a nervous artist's hands, the calculating glance of a buyer, the pursed lips of a critic passing judgment. She paused before a stall where a young painter, Julian Harrow, arranged his work. Bold abstracts in fiery reds and molten golds, each stroke pulsing with a vitality that drew murmurs from the crowd. Julian, a lean man in his late 20s, with tousled hair and an easy smile, chatted with admirers, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to the neighbouring stall, where Marcus Tate, a rival artist, glowered over his muted landscapes. There was history there, she thought, recalling the petty feuds of St. Mary's Mead, Mrs. Price and Mrs. Eldridge, who once quarrelled over a flower show ribbon until one slashed the other's roses. The fair hummed with life. Clara Wentworth, the organiser, glided among the tents, her tailored suit and practised smile as much a performance as the art itself. She was a woman of 40, with the poise of one accustomed to command. Yet Miss Marple caught the strain in her eyes, the way her fingers tightened around her clipboard. Clara's fair was a gamble, whispered the village gossips, funded by loans and tethered to the success of stars like Julian. Across the green, Rupert Langley, a portly buyer in a garish green tie, lingered near Julian's stall, his interest less in the art than in its price tag. Evelyn Price, the critic, prowled with a notebook, her sharp features set in a perpetual frown, her pen poised to wound. Miss Marple, settling on a bench with her knitting, observed them, all, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. Human nature, she mused, was the same whether in a village or a gallery. Ambition, envy, and pride wove their threads through every heart. It was nearing noon when the air shattered. A piercing scream cut through the chatter, followed by a crash of glass. Miss Marple's needles stilled. The crowd parted, revealing Julian Harrow crumpled beside his stall, his body convulsing, his hands clawing at his throat. A champagne flute lay shattered at his side, its contents seeping into the grass, catching the sunlight like spilled diamonds. His lips were tinged an unnatural blue, his eyes wide with a terror that spoke of more than pain. "Poison!" gasped a woman nearby, her voice sparking a ripple of panic. The crowd surged, then froze, as if caught in one of Julian's own paintings. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, and edged closer. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through, his bag already open. "Stand back," he barked, kneeling beside Julian. The young artist's convulsions slowed, his breathing ragged but present. "He's alive," Haydock announced, "but only just." "We need an ambulance." Inspector Craddock arrived moments later, his men cordoning off the stall with brisk efficiency. The champagne, Miss Marple noted, had come from a tray circulating among the guests, poured by Clara herself and carried by a young waiter who now seemed curiously absent. She studied the scene. Julian's canvas, untouched, glowed defiantly in the sun, but his sketchbook had fallen open, its pages revealing not art, but chaos. Angry, jagged lines scrawled in black ink. A word, faint but legible, caught her eye. Betrayed. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She thought of old Mrs. Hartley, whose husband's infidelity ended in a poisoned teacup, and Mr. Grayson, whose business partner met a similar fate after a betrayal. Poison, she knew, was not merely a weapon, but a confession. Of rage, of fear, of a heart twisted beyond reason. As the ambulance wailed in the distance, Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already threading together the fragments. Clara's strained smile, Langley's greedy eyes, Evelyn's venomous pen, Marcus's sullen glare, each held a piece of the puzzle. The fair, so glittering and bright, hid shadows she had seen before in the quiet lanes of St. Mary's Mead. Someone, she was certain, had poured death into that glass, and she would find them. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The St. Mary's Mead. Art fair, so recently a kaleidoscope of colour and ambition, had transformed into a tableau of shock and suspicion. The autumn sun, now climbing toward its zenith, cast long shadows across the village green, where white tents stood like silent sentinels over the chaos. Julian Harrow, the young artist whose bold canvases had drawn gasps of admiration, lay motionless on a stretcher as doctor. Haydock's assistants manoeuvred him toward the waiting ambulance. His face, pale as fire, the canvas he might never paint again, bore the faint blue tinge of poison, and his eyes, though open, stared blankly at the sky. The crowd, a mix of artists, buyers, and curious villagers, hovered at a distance, their whispers a low hum of fear and speculation. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood unobtrusively near Julian's stall, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The shattered champagne flute glinting in the grass, the untouched canvas glowing with fiery reds, the sketchbook splayed open to its cryptic scrawl. Inspector Craddock, a man whose competence Miss Marple respected, but whose imagination she sometimes found wanting, directed his constables with crisp efficiency. "Clear the area," he called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "No one touches anything until we've swept the scene." A cordon of rope was swiftly erected around Julian's stall, and a young constable, barely out of his teens, stood guard, his face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, unnoticed by the bustling police, edged closer, her small figure blending into the crowd like a sparrow among starlings. She had seen such scenes before, not in the grand tragedies of London, but in the quiet corners of St. Mary's Mead, where a poisoned jam tart or a tampered tonic revealed the same dark currents of human nature. The champagne flute, or what remained of it, drew her attention first. Its shards lay scattered across the grass, the stem snapped clean in two, as if Julian's fall had been violent. The liquid, now soaked into the earth, left a faint, acrid scent that Miss Marple's keen nose detected as she bent slightly, pretending to adjust her shawl. Cyanide, she suspected, recalling a long-ago case involving Mrs. Carter, who had slipped a fatal dose into her husband's evening sherry after discovering his affair. The poison was swift, merciless, and easily concealed. A single drop could kill in minutes. But how had it reached Julian's glass? The tray, she recalled, had been carried by a young waiter, a local lad named Tommy Gibbs, who had vanished in the commotion. Clara Wentworth, the fair's organizer, had poured the champagne herself, offering flutes to artists and guests alike. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The tray was the key, accessible yet intimate, a perfect vehicle for malice. She turned her attention to Julian's stall. The canvas, a swirling abstract of reds and golds, stood untouched on its easel, its vibrancy mocking the tragedy at its feet. It was a masterpiece. Even Miss Marple, no connoisseur of modern art, could see that. Bold, confident, the kind of work that made buyers like Rupert Langley salivate and critics like Evelyn Price sharpen their pens. Beside it, a small table held Julian's tools, brushes, a palette crusted with paint, a tin of turpentine. But it was the sketchbook, fallen open in the grass, that held her interest. Its pages, usually filled with precise studies, were marred by a single sheet of chaos, jagged lines scrawled in black ink, forming a distorted face, a woman's perhaps twisted in rage. Below it in a trembling hand was the word betrayed. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The sketch was no artist's whim. It was a cry, a clue, perhaps a warning. She thought of Miss Elwood, who had scribbled a frantic note before her sister's mysterious collapse at a church bazaar. Words, Miss Marple knew, could be as deadly as poison. Inspector Craddock approached, his notebook open, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with the respect he reserved for her, though tinged with exasperation. "I suppose you've already formed a theory." His tone was half-joking, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the case. A poisoning at a public event, under the noses of half the village, was no small matter. "Not a theory, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "Merely observations. The champagne, for instance. Where did it come from?" Craddock glanced at the cordoned-off area. A communal tray, served to the artists and a few guests. Clara Wentworth poured it, and a waiter, Tommy Gibbs, I believe, carried it round. "We're looking for him now." "He seems to have scarpered." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning. Tommy Gibbs, a lanky boy from the village, was no stranger to mischief. She recalled his pilfering apples from Mrs. Norton's orchard. But murder? Unlikely, unless he was someone's tool. And the glass itself, she asked, was it Julian's alone, or could it have been meant for another? Craddock frowned. "Hard to say." The tray was passed around freely. Anyone could have taken a glass. "We're testing the shards for residue, but it'll take time." He hesitated, then added, "Doctor. Haydock says it's likely cyanide. Fast-acting, deadly in small doses. Whoever did this knew what they were about. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. Cyanide was not a poison one stumbled upon. It required intent, access, perhaps knowledge of chemistry. She thought of the suspects she had observed that morning. Clara Wentworth, whose fare depended on Julian's success. Rupert Langley, the buyer whose greed was palpable. Evelyn Price, the critic whose venom could ruin careers. And Marcus Tate, the rival whose resentment smouldered like a coal. Each had been near the tray at some point, she was certain, but who had the opportunity and the will to slip death into Julian's glass? She stepped back, allowing Craddock to continue his work, and let her gaze wander over the fair. Clara Wentworth stood near her tent, her face pale but composed, answering questions from a constable. Her clipboard, Miss Marple noted, was clutched tightly, as if it were a shield. Rupert Langley lingered at a nearby stall, his loud tie a jarring note against the sombre mood, his eyes darting toward Julian's canvas as if calculating its worth even now. Evelyn Price, her A notebook tucked under her arm, spoke sharply to a young artist, her gloved hands, unnecessary in the warm September light, catching Miss Marple's attention. Gloves could hide much, she thought, recalling Mrs. Langley's habit of wearing them to conceal a telltale stain of ink, or worse. And Marcus Tate, his stall now deserted, stood alone, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the cordoned-off scene with an intensity that spoke of more than curiosity. Miss Marple's mind drifted to parallels from her village. There was Mr. Henshaw, who had poisoned a rival's dog over a disputed fence line, his anger masked by a neighbourly smile, and Miss Carver, whose jealousy of a choir rival led to a tampered thermos of tea. Poison, she knew, was the weapon of the cunning, the resentful, the desperate. It required no strength, only opportunity, and a heart cold enough to act. But who, among these four, had such a heart? Clara, whose ambition might have turned to desperation if Julian's success faltered? Langley, whose wealth could not buy Julian's loyalty? Evelyn, whose pride had been wounded by a young artist's rise? Or Marcus, whose rivalry seemed to burn deeper than professional envy? She approached the cordon, catching Craddock's eye. "Might I take a closer look at the sketchbook, Inspector?" she asked, her tone deferential. "It may hold nothing, of course, but—" Craddock sighed, accustomed to her requests. "Very well, but don't touch it." "Constable, let Miss Marple through." Under the constable's watchful gaze, Miss Marple bent over the sketchbook, her eyes tracing the angry lines. The face, though distorted, suggested a woman, sharp cheekbones, a twisted mouth. The word betrayed was scrawled in a hand that trembled, not with fear, but with rage. Was it Julian's hand or another's planted to mislead? She thought of Mrs. Finch, who had left a forged letter to deflect suspicion after a theft. The sketchbook felt personal, a glimpse into Julian's mind, or someone's attempt to paint it so. She straightened, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "Anything, Miss Marple?" Craddock asked, half expecting her to unravel the case on the spot. "Only a thought," she said lightly. "The tray, Inspector. Did anyone see who took the glass Julian drank from?" Craddock shook his head. "Not yet." The crowd was thick, and people were milling about. "We're questioning everyone who was near the stall." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the waiter, Tommy Gibbs. He was a key, she felt, though whether as perpetrator or pawn remained unclear. She recalled his mother, Mrs. Gibbs, a nervous woman who doted on her son despite his waywardness. Had Tommy been bribed, coerced, or simply careless? And Clara, who had poured the champagne. Her hands had been steady, her smile unwavering. But Miss Marple knew how well ambition could mask deceit. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, who had sabotaged a rival's cake at a village fete, her face all innocence as the judges coughed and sputtered. As the ambulance pulled away, Its siren fading into the distance, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes sweeping the scene once more. The fair was quieter now, the crowd subdued, but the tension remained, like a taut string waiting to snap. She noted the positions of the suspects. Clara, now conferring with a group of artists, her gestures too animated. Langley, slipping towards the refreshment tent, his gait purposeful. Evelyn, scribbling in her notebook, her back to the chaos. And Marcus, still watching, his face unreadable. Each had opportunity, she thought, but motive was the thread she needed to pull. She returned to her bench, retrieving her knitting from her bag. The needles resumed their rhythm, a counterpoint to her thoughts. Poison was a coward's weapon, but it required boldness to act in broad daylight, under the eyes of a crowd. Someone had been brazen, certain they could slip away unnoticed. But Miss Marple, who had unravelled the secrets of St. Mary's Meadtime, and again knew that no one escaped the truth forever. The sketchbook, the tray, the vanished waiter, they were pieces of a puzzle she would fit together stitch by stitch, just as she knitted her scarves. And somewhere, in the glittering facade of the art fair, a killer waited, believing themselves unseen. They were wrong. Chapter 3. The organizer's charm, the saint, Mary's Mead Art Fair, though subdued by the morning's grim events, clung to a semblance of its former vitality. The sun, now dipping toward afternoon, cast a softer light over the tents, where artists rearranged their displays with nervous hands, and buyers murmured in hushed tones. Julian Harrow's stall remained cordoned off, a stark reminder of the poison that had struck so swiftly. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag resting on her lap, sat in the organizer's tent, a small canvas structure adorned with bunting and a neatly lettered sign reading Fair Headquarters. Across from her sat Clara Wentworth, the fair's orchestrator, her tailored navy suit pristine despite the day's chaos. A cup of tea steamed between them, its fragrance mingling with the faint scent of Clara's rosewater perfume. Clara's face, framed by auburn hair pinned in an elegant chignon, held a practised composure. But Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the telltale signs of strain. The slight tremor in her manicured fingers as she stirred her tea, the fleeting shadow that crossed her hazel eyes when Julian's name was mentioned. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful," Clara said, her voice pitched to convey just the right degree of sorrow. "Julian was our star, you know. His work drew crowds, buyers, even that wretched critic, Evelyn Price. Who could want him harmed?" Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple, who had heard similar protestations from Mrs. Langley after a church fund was mysteriously depleted, noted the careful cadence, as if Clara had rehearsed her lines. The tent, though modest, was a hub of activity. A desk overflowed with papers, schedules, vendor lists, and a ledger that Miss Marple's quick glance suggested was meticulously kept. A tray of biscuits sat untouched, and a small vase of marigolds added a touch of cheer that felt oddly out of place. Clara's clipboard, her constant companion, lay within reach, its pages marked with cryptic notes and checkmarks. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, let the silence linger, knowing how often it prompted unguarded words. "You must have worked tirelessly to make this fair a success," she said at last, her tone gentle, almost admiring. "It's no small thing to organize such an event, especially with so much at stake." Clara's smile flickered, a crack in her polished facade. "Oh, it's been a labor of love," she replied, her fingers brushing the clipboard. "But yes, the stakes are high. The fair brings prestige to St. Mary's Mead, and, well, it's no secret I've invested everything in it. Time, money, reputation." Her voice caught, and she looked away, toward the tent's open flap, where the cordoned-off stall was just visible. Miss Marple noted the glance, recalling Mrs. Eldridge, who had orchestrated a village fete with similar zeal, only to sabotage a rival's display when her own efforts faltered. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could curdle into something darker when threatened. She set her teacup down, her movements deliberate. "Julian's success must have been a great boon," she said, watching Clara closely. "His paintings were drawing such attention. I imagine his misfortune could affect the fair's prospects." Clara's eyes sharpened, but her smile held. "It's a tragedy, of course, but the fair will go on. It must. People will talk, naturally, but scandal can draw crowds as much as talent." Her tone was pragmatic, almost cold, and Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. Clara's words echoed those of Mrs. Finch, who had turned a theft at a charity auction into a spectacle to boost attendance. Could Clara, facing financial strain, have seen Julian's collapse as a twisted opportunity? The thought lingered, though Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. "And the champagne," Miss Marple continued, her voice as soft as a breeze. "You poured it yourself, I believe." Such a generous touch. Offering it to the artists and guests, Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on her spoon. "Yes, a little tradition of mine. I poured from a single bottle, you see, to toast the fair's opening. Tommy Gibbs, he's a local boy, carried the tray. I can't imagine how anything could have gone wrong." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way her eyes darted to the clipboard as if seeking refuge. Tommy Gibbs, the missing waiter, was a thread to tug, but Clara's role in the tray's journey was equally compelling. Had she poured the poison herself, or merely provided the means for another's malice? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Norton, who had served tainted lemonade at a garden party, claiming innocence while her rival writhed. Tommy Gibbs, Miss Marple mused, as if the name had just occurred to her. "A spirited lad, isn't he? I recall him climbing Mrs. Hartley's apple trees last summer. Do you know him well?" Clara's smile tightened. "Not terribly. I hired him through his mother, Mrs. Gibbs. He's reliable enough for small jobs, carrying trays, setting up tables. He was here this morning, but I haven't seen him since." Her voice trailed off, and she busied herself with her tea. Miss Marple noted the evasion, subtle but present. Clara's knowledge of Tommy might be deeper than she admitted, and her quick hiring of a local boy raised questions. Was he a convenient scapegoat, or had he acted on her behalf? Miss Marple's mind drifted to a village dance years ago, where a hired hand had slipped a laxative into a punch bowl at the behest of a jealous hostess. The tent flap rustled, and a young constable poked his head in. "Miss Wentworth, Inspector Craddock would like a word when you're free." Clara nodded, her composure returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Of course, I'll be right there," she said, rising with a grace that belied her earlier unease. She turned to Miss Marple, her smile warm but fleeting. "You'll excuse me, Miss Marple. Duty calls. I do hope you'll enjoy the rest of the fair, despite everything." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "Of course, my dear. And thank you for the tea." As Clara exited, her clipboard clutched like a talisman. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes lingering on the desk. The ledger, half hidden beneath a stack of flyers, beckoned. She thought of Mrs. Carver, whose meticulous accounts had revealed a pattern of deceit when a village fund went missing. Clara's ledger, she suspected, might hold similar secrets. Debts, perhaps, or payments that pointed to motive. But she would not pry, not yet. The truth, she knew, often emerged in the quiet spaces between words and actions. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and stepped out into the fair. The crowd had thinned, but the tension remained, a palpable thread weaving through the tents. Clara's figure receded toward Inspector Craddock, who stood near Julian's stall, his notebook open. Miss Marple's gaze swept the green, noting the other suspects. Rupert Langley, his garish tie a beacon, haggled with an artist 2 stalls down, his laughter too loud for the occasion. Evelyn Price, her gloves still conspicuous, scribbled furiously in her notebook, her back to the cordon, as if distancing herself from the crime. Marcus Tate, alone at his stall, stared at his own paintings, his hands clenched into fists. Each, Miss Marple thought, had their own dance with ambition, pride, or envy, and one had stepped too far. She paused by a nearby tent, pretending to admire a watercolour of the village church. But her mind was elsewhere. Clara's charm was a mask, she was certain, but what lay beneath? Financial desperation, perhaps, if the fair's success hung by a thread. Or something personal, a grudge against Julian, a fear of his growing fame. Miss Marple recalled the sketchbook scrawl, the word betrayed. Had Julian betrayed Clara in some way, professionally, or perhaps intimately? The thought was not idle. She remembered Mrs. Henshaw, who had poisoned a rival's tea after a whispered affair came to light. Clara's polished exterior might conceal a similar wound. As she moved toward the refreshment tent, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects. Langley's greed, Evelyn's spite, Marcus's resentment, each was a thread in the tapestry. But Clara's role as the fair's heart gave her unique access. The champagne tray, the missing waiter, the ledger, all were pieces of a puzzle she would assemble with care. For now, she would watch, listen, and let the truth reveal itself, as it always did in St. Mary's Mead. The fair, with its glittering surface, hid a poison deeper than cyanide, and Miss Marple, her needles still in her bag, was already unravelling its threads. Chapter 4. The Buyer's Offer, the St. Mary's Mead. Art Fair, though shaken by Julian Harrow's collapse, pressed on with a stubborn resilience, its tents glowing under the softening light of late afternoon. The crowd, though thinner, still milled about, their voices a low murmur punctuated by the occasional clink of teacups or rustle of canvas. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, wandered slowly among the stalls, her small figure unremarkable amidst the vibrant chaos. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle, darting from one detail to the next. The way an artist adjusted a frame, the flicker of calculation in a buyer's glance, the shadow of unease that lingered over the fair like a mist. She paused near a stall displaying serene landscapes, their muted greens a stark contrast to Julian's fiery abstracts, and spotted Rupert Langley, the wealthy buyer, examining a small oil painting with exaggerated care. Rupert Langley was a man who wore his prosperity like a badge. His portly frame was draped in a tweed suit, its quality marred by a garish green tie that seemed to shout for attention. His face, ruddy and lined with the confidence of wealth, bore a perpetual half-smile, as if he knew secrets others did not. Miss Marple approached, her steps deliberate, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Mr. Langley, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but clear. "Such a lovely painting you're admiring. Though I confess Julian Harrow's work seems to have caught everyone's eye today." Langley turned, his smile widening as he took in the elderly woman before him. "Miss Marple, I presume," he replied, his tone genial, but with a hint of condescension. "You're quite right about Julian. A genius, that boy, though a touch too stubborn for his own good." He chuckled, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in his eyes, the way his fingers toyed with the gold watch chain dangling from his waistcoat. She thought of Mr. Thompson, a village merchant who had smashed a rival's window after a deal went sour, his joviality masking a temper as quick as tinder. They moved to a nearby bench, where Langley, ever the gentleman, offered her a seat. "Terrible business what happened to Julian," he said, settling beside her. "I was just admiring his latest piece before all this." He gestured vaguely toward the cordoned-off stall, where a constable stood guard, his young face stern against the curious glances of passers-by. Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she studied Langley. His casual mention of Julian's work was too practised, she thought, like Mrs. Hartley's airy dismissal of a stolen recipe that later proved her undoing. "You were interested in his paintings, I understand," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "Such bold colours. I imagine they'd fetch a fine price." Langley's eyes gleamed, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Oh, indeed. I offered him £20,000 for that big abstract, the red and gold one, you know. A steal, really, for a talent like his. But Julian, well, he refused, said it wasn't for sale, not yet." His smile faltered, and Miss Marple caught the edge in his voice, a sharpness that spoke of more than disappointment. She recalled Mr. Grayson, who had threatened a neighbour over a refused land sale, his pride stung as much as his purse. Langley's wealth gave him power, but rejection, she knew, could turn even a rich man bitter. "Not for sale," she repeated, tilting her head as if puzzled. "How curious. I'd have thought a young artist would jump at such an offer." Langley shrugged, but his fingers tightened on his watch chain. "Young artists are often foolish." Julian thought he could hold out for more, play the market, you see. Said he had another buyer lined up, someone from London. I told him he was making a mistake, but he wouldn't listen. His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck, the way his eyes darted toward Julian's stall. Greed, she thought, was a powerful motive, but so was wounded pride. Had Langley, spurned by a mere artist, taken revenge in a glass of champagne? She let the silence stretch, a tactic she had perfected in countless village parlours. Langley shifted, his smile returning but less certain. "Mind you," he added, "I wasn't the only one after his work." That critic, Evelyn Price, was sniffing around, probably planning to tear him apart in her next review. And Marcus Tate, his rival, you know, looked ready to burn the whole fair down just to outshine him. He chuckled again, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the deflection, the way he steered the conversation from himself. She thought of Mrs. Norton, who had pointed fingers at a neighbour to cover her own tampering with a rival's garden. "And you were near the champagne tray, I suppose?" Miss Marple said, her voice so gentle it might have been a passing thought. It was such a kind gesture of Miss Wentworth's, offering drinks to everyone. Langley's smile froze, just for a moment. "Oh, yes, I took a glass myself. Perfectly fine, mind you. I was nowhere near Julian when well, you know." He waved a hand, but Miss Marple noted the haste in his words, the way his eyes avoided hers. She recalled the tray's path, Clara pouring, Tommy Gibbs carrying, and Langley, by his own admission, close enough to take a glass. Close enough, perhaps, to slip something into another. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock had suggested, was easily concealed. A powder, a liquid, a moment's distraction. She thought of Mr. Henshaw, who had poisoned a rival's dog with a sleight of hand. No one noticed until too late. "Such a tragedy," she murmured, her eyes soft but watchful. "And yet life goes on, doesn't it?" "The fair continues, and I dare say Julian's paintings will be worth even more now, poor boy." Langley's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "A grim truth, Miss Marple. Tragedy often inflates value. Collectors are already circling, you know. I might make another offer if the family's willing." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught the hunger beneath it, the way his gaze lingered on Julian's stall. She thought of Mr. Carver, who had swooped in to buy a rival's land after a suspicious fire, his sympathy as false as his tears. Langley's interest in Julian's work, she suspected, had not ended with the artist's collapse. Perhaps it had only begun. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and thanked him for his time. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Langley," she said, her smile as warm as a village hearth. "I do hope the fair brings you what you're seeking." He tipped his hat, his expression genial but guarded, and Miss Marple moved away, her steps slow but purposeful. The fair buzzed around her, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of Langley's words. His offer, rejected, his presence near the tray, his quickness to point to others. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her knack for untangling village intrigues, knew how to follow them. As she passed Julian's stall, still roped off, she glanced at the sketchbook, its angry scrawl of betrayed etched in her memory. Had Julian betrayed Langley by refusing his offer, or was the betrayal deeper, personal? She thought of Mrs. Finch, whose forged letter had misdirected suspicion after a theft, and wondered if the sketchbook was a similar ruse, or a genuine cry. Langley's wealth gave him means, his pride gave him motive, but Miss Marple knew better than to settle on one suspect too soon. Clara's ambition, Evelyn's spite, Marcus's jealousy, they all wove into the same tapestry, and somewhere in its threads lay the truth. She paused by the refreshment tent, where Clara Wentworth was speaking to a group of artists, her clipboard a constant prop. Evelyn Price, her gloves still on, scribbled nearby, her pen as sharp as her tongue. Marcus Tate, at his stall, stared at his own work with a scowl that spoke of defeat. And Langley, now haggling over another painting, his laughter ringing out, seemed untouched by the day's darkness. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Someone had poisoned Julian's glass, and Langley, with his greed and his wounded pride, was a piece of the puzzle. But the picture was not yet complete, and she would wait, as she always did, for the pattern to emerge. Chapter 5. The Critic's Venom, the Saint. Mary's Mead Art Fair, as the afternoon waned, took on a subdued air, the earlier vibrancy dimmed by the shadow of Julian Harrow's poisoning. The tents, still bright against the village green, seemed to sag under the weight of whispered speculations. Visitors moved with cautious steps, their eyes darting toward the cordoned-off stall, where Julian's fiery abstracts stood as silent witnesses to the morning's horror. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, threaded her way through the crowd, her small frame unnoticed by those caught in their own dramas. Her destination was the refreshment tent, where Evelyn Price, the critic whose sharp pen was as feared as any blade, stood scribbling in her notebook, her gloved hands a curious anomaly in the warm September light. Evelyn was a woman of angular severity, tall, thin, with a face like a hawk's, her dark eyes perpetually narrowed as if dissecting the world. Her grey hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her black dress, though elegant, gave her the air of a mourner at a festival. The gloves, black leather and immaculate, caught Miss Marple's attention most. They were out of place, impractical for note-taking, and Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Langley, who had worn gloves to conceal ink stains after forging a letter to ruin a rival. Gloves, she knew, could hide more than stains, perhaps a vial, a powder, a moment's sleight of hand. She approached Evelyn with a smile as mild as chamomile tea, her voice soft but deliberate. "Miss Price, how kind of you to stay on after such a dreadful event. Your reviews must be invaluable to these young artists." Evelyn's pen paused, and she glanced up, her lips curling into a thin, humourless smile. "Miss Marple, is it? I'm surprised you take an interest in art. It's a brutal world, you know, full of egos and illusions." Her voice was sharp, like the snap of a twig, and Miss Marple noted the disdain that coloured it, a tone she had heard from Miss Carver, whose cutting remarks at a village sewing circle had masked a deeper grudge. Evelyn's contempt, she suspected, was not merely professional but personal, rooted in something more than aesthetic judgment. They stood near a table, laden with teacups and a dwindling plate of scones, the tent's canvas walls muffling the hum of the fair. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted Evelyn's posture, rigid, defensive, her notebook clutched like a shield. "Julian Harrow's work seemed to draw quite a crowd," she said, her tone conversational. "Such bold colours. I imagine you had thoughts on his style." Evelyn's smile tightened, and her gloved fingers tapped the notebook. "Julian. Overrated, I'm afraid. All flash and no substance. His abstracts are garish, lacking discipline. I told him so last month in my column. He didn't take it well." Her words were clipped, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, as if wounding Julian had been a pleasure. She thought of Mrs. Norton, whose public criticism of a neighbour's baking had escalated into a feud that ended with a tampered cake. Evelyn's review, she suspected, had been more than critique. It had been a gauntlet thrown. "You knew him personally, then?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes soft but searching, like a grandmother probing a child's fib. She settled onto a folding chair, gesturing for Evelyn to join her. Knowing the act of sitting often loosened tongues. Evelyn hesitated, then sat, her movements precise. "Not personally, no. But I mentored him, briefly, 2 years ago when he was starting out. He had raw talent, I'll grant him that, but no focus. I tried to guide him, but he grew arrogant, dismissed my advice, said my reviews were irrelevant in the modern art world." Her voice dripped with scorn, and Miss Marple noted the way her gloved hands clenched, the leather creaking faintly. A personal slight, then, she thought, recalling Miss Elwood, who had sabotaged a rival's embroidery after a similar dismissal. Pride, especially in one accustomed to wielding power, could fester into something deadly. "How hurtful that must have been," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, inviting confession, "to have your expertise so disregarded, and by one so young." Evelyn's eyes flashed, but she caught herself, smoothing her expression. "It's nothing new in this business. Artists like Julian think they're above criticism. He mocked me publicly at a gallery opening last spring, called my work stale, in front of a crowd. I warned him his ego would be his downfall." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple heard the venom beneath, a bitterness that went beyond professional rivalry. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw, whose public humiliation by a rival led to a poisoned cup of tea, the act as much about restoring pride as exacting revenge. "And you were near the champagne tray this morning, I believe?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Such a lovely gesture. From Miss Wentworth, though so tragic now." Evelyn's pen stilled, and her eyes narrowed. "I took a glass, yes, like everyone else. I was nowhere near Julian when he collapsed. I was reviewing another stall, Marcus Tate's, as it happens. His work is dull, but at least it's honest." Her deflection was swift, and Miss Marple noted the way she emphasized Marcus's name, as if casting suspicion elsewhere. She recalled Mrs. Finch, who had pointed fingers at a neighbour to cover her own theft. Evelyn's gloves, she thought, could have concealed a vial of cyanide, slipped into a glass during a moment's distraction. The tray had been within reach of many, but Evelyn's proximity and her motive made her a thread worth following. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence work its magic. Evelyn shifted, her notebook now closed, her gloved hands resting on it like sentinels. "You must see all sorts of characters in your work," Miss Marple said, her tone musing. "People like Mr. Langley, for instance, so eager to buy Julian's paintings. Or Miss Wentworth." Putting her heart into this fair Evelyn's lips twitched, a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Langley's a vulture, circling for profit. He'd buy a child's scribble if he thought it'd double in value. And Clara, her ambition outweighs her sense. This fair is her gamble, and Julian was her golden goose. His collapse might ruin her, or it might make her. Scandal sells, you know." Her words were sharp, and Miss Marple noted the glee in them, as if Evelyn relished the chaos. She thought of Miss Carver again, whose spiteful gossip had stirred a village feud, her satisfaction masking a deeper intent. "And Marcus Tate?" Miss Marple prompted, her eyes bright with curiosity. "He seemed quite overshadowed by Julian's success." Evelyn's smirk faded, replaced by a frown. "Marcus is talented, in his way, but he's eaten up with envy. He and Julian were at daggers drawn, always competing, always bickering. Marcus was near the tray too, you know, hovering like a sulky child." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the calculation in it, the way she seeded doubt about another suspect. She recalled the sketchbook scrawl, "Betrayed," and wondered if Evelyn's mentoring of Julian had held a deeper bond, one broken by his rejection. Betrayal, she knew, could cut as deeply as love, and Evelyn's pride was a fragile thing. Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her shawl, her smile as warm as ever. "You've been most kind to share your insights, Miss Price. I'm sure your reviews will guide many an artist, even in such trying times." Evelyn nodded, her expression guarded, and returned to her notebook, her pen resuming its furious dance. Miss Marple stepped out of the tent, her mind turning over the encounter. Evelyn's venom was clear. Her wounded pride, her gloved hands, her proximity to the tray. But was it enough to kill? She thought of Mrs. Norton's poisoned cake, a petty act born of spite, and wondered if Evelyn's motive was similarly small or something grander, a need to crush a star who had dared to outshine her. The fair stretched before her, its colours muted by the lengthening shadows. Clara Wentworth was visible near her tent, her clipboard a constant companion, her smile strained as she spoke to a constable. Rupert Langley, his green tie a garish note, haggled over a painting, his laughter too loud. Marcus Tate, at his stall, stared at his own work with a scowl that spoke of defeat. And Evelyn, now scribbling again, seemed to retreat into her own world. Her gloves a silent clue. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The poison had come from somewhere, and Evelyn's bitterness was a thread in the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet clear. She would watch, as always, and let the truth unfold stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 6. The Rivals Shadow the Saint. Mary's Mead Art Fair, as evening approached, took on a melancholic glow. The tents bathed in the amber light of a sinking sun. The crowd had dwindled to a scattering of resolute buyers and artists, their voices hushed as if reluctant to disturb the lingering spectre of Julian Harrow's poisoning. The cordoned-off stall, with its vibrant canvas of reds and golds, stood like a shrine to the fallen artist. Its ropes a barrier between the living and the near-dead. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved with quiet purpose toward the stall of Marcus Tate, Julian's rival, whose muted landscapes hung in stark contrast to the brilliance across the green. Her steps were slow, her expression one of mild interest, but her eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The slump of Marcus's shoulders, the clench of his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted with a paintbrush, as if it were a weapon. Marcus was a young man in his early 30s, lean and brooding, with dark hair that fell untidily over his brow. His stall, though neatly arranged, lacked the vibrancy of Julian's, its earthy greens and sombre browns drawing few admirers. He stood alone, his gaze fixed on his own work, but Miss Marple noted how his eyes flicked toward Julian's stall, a flash of something darker than envy in their depths. She approached, her smile as gentle as a village breeze, and paused before a painting of a misty moor. "Such a restful scene, mister." "Tate," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Your work has a quiet beauty, so different from Mr. Harrow's bold style." Marcus started, as if pulled from a reverie, and turned to her, his expression guarded. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, tinged with a bitterness that seemed to seep from his very pores. "Quiet, yes. Too quiet for most, it seems." Julian's flash always stole the show. His words were clipped, and Miss Marple thought of young Tommy Blake, who had tripped a rival in a village race, his envy as plain as Marcus's now. She settled onto a folding chair beside the stall, her knitting bag on her lap, and gestured for him to sit, knowing that a shared moment could loosen even the tightest tongue. "You and Mr. Harrow must have known each other well," she said, her tone one of kindly curiosity. "Competing at the same fair, with such different visions. It can't have been easy." Marcus sat, his hands still clutching the paintbrush, his knuckles white. "We went to art school together," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Julian was always the star. Teachers loved him, galleries wanted him. I worked just as hard, but my style. It's not what people want. Not like his. His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the raw edge of resentment, like a wound that had never healed. She recalled Mrs. Eldridge, whose jealousy of a rival's roses had led to a midnight sabotage, her bitterness a mirror to Marcus's. Rivalry, she knew, could twist the heart as surely as love or greed. She let the silence linger, her hands resting on her bag, though her needles seemed to click in her mind. "It must be discouraging," she said at last, "to see another's work so celebrated. I imagine you were near his stall often today." Watching the crowds, Marcus's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of wariness in them. "I kept to my own space," he said too quickly. "I saw the tray, of course. Clara's champagne nonsense. Everyone did. But I wasn't near Julian when he trailed off, his gaze drifting back to the cordoned-off stall, where a constable stood watch. Miss Marple noted the lie, subtle but present. She had seen Marcus hovering near Julian's stall before the scream, his posture tense, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. She thought of Mr. Henshaw, who had denied tampering with a rival's fence, his denial as flimsy as Marcus's now. "The champagne tray," she mused, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Such a generous touch, though so tragic now. You must have taken a glass yourself." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he set the paintbrush down with deliberate care. "I didn't drink. I don't care for champagne. Too showy, like Julian." His tone was sharp, and Miss Marple caught the personal sting in it, as if Julian's flamboyance were a direct affront. She recalled the sketchbook scrawl, "Betrayed," and wondered if Marcus's rivalry went beyond art. Had Julian taken something more precious than acclaim? A friendship? A love? A chance? She thought of Miss Carver, whose envy of a choir rival had led to a tampered thermos, the act born of a deeper wound. "You and Julian were close once, perhaps?" she asked, her voice as soft as a whisper, inviting confidence without demanding it. Marcus's hands clenched, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. "We were friends once." Before he changed. He took everything, attention, opportunities, even he stopped, his eyes darkening, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Even what? She thought of Mrs. Norton, whose rivalry over a garden prize had masked a deeper betrayal, an affair exposed, a heart broken. Marcus's pause was a thread, and she would tug it gently. "Even?" she prompted, her eyes soft but searching, like a grandmother coaxing a secret from a reluctant child. He looked away, his fingers tracing the edge of a canvas. "It doesn't matter now," he muttered. "He's gone, isn't he?" Or as good as the words were cold, but Miss Marple heard the tremor beneath, the mix of anger and grief that spoke of a wound unhealed. She noted his proximity to the tray that morning, his lingering near Julian's stall, his hands in his pockets, pockets that could have held a vial, a powder, a moment's malice. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock had said, was swift and subtle, requiring only a second's opportunity. She thought of Mr. Grayson, who had poisoned a rival's wine after a business deal soured, his envy as potent as Marcus's seemed now. She shifted, her shawl slipping slightly, and changed tack. "Your paintings have such depth, Mr. Tate," she said, gesturing to the moorland scene. "They remind me of the quiet beauty of our village. I'm sure they'll find their audience." In time, Marcus's expression softened, but only for a moment. "Time," he said bitterly, "is something Julian always had more of." even now with him. Like that, his work's all anyone talks about. His voice was a mix of resignation and rage, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on Julian's stall, the canvas glowing like a taunt. She thought of the sketchbook again, its angry lines and the word betrayed. Had Marcus drawn it, planting a clue to mislead? Or had Julian, in a moment of clarity, named his betrayer? She recalled Mrs. Finch, who had left a forged note to deflect suspicion after a theft, her cunning as subtle as it was cruel. Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her smile as warm as ever. "You've been most kind to share your thoughts, Mr. Tate," she said. "I do hope the fair brings you the recognition you deserve." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned back to his paintings, his hands once more clutching the brush. Miss Marple moved away, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind turning over the encounter. Marcus's jealousy was a fire, burning hot and deep, but was it hot enough to kill? His proximity to the tray, his bitter history with Julian, his evasive answers, all were threads in the tapestry, but the pattern remained elusive. The fair was quieter now, the evening chill settling over the green. Clara Wentworth stood near her tent, her clipboard a constant shield, her smile strained as she spoke to a lingering buyer. Rupert Langley, his green tie a jarring note, laughed loudly at another stall, his greed undimmed by the day's tragedy. Evelyn Price, her gloves still on, scribbled in her notebook, her back to the cordoned-off stall as if it held no interest. And Marcus, alone with his paintings, seemed to shrink into his own shadow, his resentment a palpable weight. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The poison had come from someone, and Marcus's rivalry was a thread as dark as any. But the truth, she knew, lay in the weaving of all these strands. She would wait, as she always did, for the moment when the pattern became clear. Chapter 7. A pattern emerges, the Saint, Mary's Mead Art Fair, as twilight settled over the village green, took on a hushed, almost mournful air. The tents, their white canvas now tinged with the soft purples of evening, stood like ghosts against the fading light, their vibrancy muted by the day's grim events. The crowd had all but dispersed, leaving only a few artists packing their wares, and a handful of villagers lingering, drawn by curiosity or the hope of gossip. Julian Harrow's stall, still cordoned off, was a dark centerpiece, its fiery canvas glowing faintly under a makeshift tarp, as if defiant even in the artist's absence. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, sat in her cottage parlour, the fire casting flickering shadows across the chintz curtains. Her knitting lay untouched on the table, a skein of soft grey wool beside it, for her mind was too busy weaving a different kind of pattern, one of human motives and hidden truths. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, stared into the flames as she sifted through the day's observations. The poison, Dr. Haydock had confirmed to Inspector Craddock that afternoon, was almost certainly cyanide, swift, odourless in small doses, and deadly within minutes. It had been slipped into Julian's champagne, likely from the communal tray that Clara Wentworth had poured, and Tommy Gibbs, the missing waiter, had carried. The tray, Miss Marple thought, was the pivot around which the crime turned, a seemingly innocent gesture that had become a vehicle for murder. But who had seized the moment and why? Her mind, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, turned to the four suspects, each a thread in the tapestry she was beginning to discern. Clara Wentworth, with her polished charm and desperate ambition, had orchestrated the fair with the precision of a conductor. But her financial strain was no secret. Miss Marple recalled overhearing Mrs. Gibbs at the village shop whispering of Clara's loans, taken to fund the event, with Julian's success as her collateral. A scandal could ruin her, but a martyr's death might inflate his painting's value, turning loss into profit. She thought of Mrs. Finch, who had staged a theft to claim insurance, her smile as false as Clara's seemed now. Yet Clara's hands pouring the champagne had been steady. Too steady, perhaps, for one so burdened. Rupert Langley, the buyer, was another thread, his greed as vivid as his garish green tie. His £20,000 offer for Julian's painting, rejected in favour of a London buyer, had stung his pride as much as his purse. Miss Marple recalled Mr. Thompson, whose rage at a spurned deal led to a smashed shop window, his joviality a mask for spite. Langley's presence near the tray, his casual admission of taking a glass, placed him close to the crime, but his motive, wounded pride or lost profit, seemed too petty for murder. Or was it? She thought of the sketchbook scrawl, betrayed, and wondered if Julian's refusal had cut deeper than Langley let on. Evelyn Price, the critic, wove a darker thread, her venom as sharp as her pen. Her public humiliation by Julian, who had called her reviews irrelevant, had left a wound that festered. Miss Marple thought of Miss Carver, whose spiteful gossip at a sewing circle hid a plan to sabotage a rival's work. Evelyn's gloved hands, so conspicuous in the warm September light, could have concealed a vial of cyanide. Slipped into a glass during a moment's distraction. Her proximity to the tray, her bitter mentoring of Julian, her quickness to point to Marcus, all suggested a mind as calculating as it was cruel. But was her pride, so publicly bruised, motive enough for poison? Marcus Tate, the rival, was the darkest thread of all, his jealousy a smouldering fire. His brooding presence near Julian's stall, his hands in his pockets, his evasive answers about the champagne tray, all pointed to opportunity. His admission of a lost friendship, cut short by Julian's betrayal, hinted at a motive deeper than professional rivalry. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Norton, whose envy of a neighbour's garden had masked a personal wound, an affair exposed, a heart broken. Marcus's pause when speaking of Julian taking everything suggested a similar betrayal, perhaps a woman, perhaps more. The sketchbook's angry lines, its word betrayed, could have been his work, a deliberate misdirection, or Julian's naming his foe. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, who had scribbled a frantic note before her sister's poisoning, her words a clue to the truth. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her needles, but she remained still, her mind stitching the pieces together. The tray was the key, but its accessibility complicated the pattern. Clara had poured, Tommy had carried. Langley and Evelyn had taken glasses. Marcus had lingered nearby. Any could have acted, but cyanide required intent, access to the poison, knowledge of its use, a moment's nerve. She recalled Dr. Haydock's words. Cyanide was not a household item, often linked to photography or chemistry, requiring a connection to procure it. Clara's organisational reach, Langley's wealth, Evelyn's urban contacts, Marcus's art school background, each could have found a way. The sketchbook nagged at her, its scrawl a jagged tear in the fabric of the case. Was it Julian's cry, or a killer's ruse. She thought of the face it depicted, distorted, female, furious. Could it be Clara, betrayed by a promise unkept? Evelyn, stung by rejection? Or another, unknown to her yet, a lover perhaps, whose shadow loomed over the fair? Miss Marple's mind drifted to Tommy Gibbs, the vanished waiter. His absence was no accident, she was certain. She recalled his mother, Mrs. Gibbs, a nervous woman who doted on her wayward son. Had Tommy been bribed, coerced, or simply fled in panic? His role, however small, was a thread she must follow. She rose, moving to the window, where the village green lay quiet under the first stars. The fair was closed for the night, its tents dark, but Miss Marple's mind was alight. The suspect's movements formed a dance. Clara's orchestration, Langley's circling, Evelyn's scribbling, Marcus's brooding. Each had motive, each had opportunity. But the truth lay in the why, the hidden spark that had turned resentment into murder. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when Mrs. Eldridge's sabotage of a rival's roses had seemed petty, until a deeper betrayal, a stolen love, came to light. The fair, with its glittering surface, hid a similar truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would find it. Returning to her chair, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly as her thoughts wove on. Tomorrow she would return to the fair, seek out Tommy Gibbs, and probe the sketchbook further. The pattern was emerging, faint but clear, like a stitch taking shape in grey wool. Someone had poisoned Julian Harrow, believing their act unseen, but Miss Marple, who had unravelled the secrets of St. Mary's Meadtime, and again knew that no thread could remain hidden forever. Chapter 8. A Hidden Clue. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Mead with a tentative glow, as if uncertain whether to bless or expose the secrets of the village green. The art fair, resuming despite the shadow of Julian Harrow's poisoning, stirred with a cautious energy, its tents crisp against the dew-kissed grass. Artists adjusted their displays with forced cheer, while buyers and villagers whispered of the tragedy, their eyes drawn to the cordoned-off stall, where Julian's vibrant canvas stood like a silent accusation. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag of familiar weight on her arm, arrived early, her small figure blending into the crowd as she moved with quiet purpose. Her mind, sharp as the needles tucked in her bag, was fixed on the fragments of the case. The champagne tray, the vanished waiter, the sketchbook scrawl of betrayed. Today, she resolved, she would tug at a new thread, one that might unravel the pattern further. The fair was quieter than the previous day, the bustle tempered by unease. Miss Marple paused near Julian's stall, where Inspector Craddock's men were concluding their sweep of the scene. The shattered champagne flute had been collected, its shards sent for analysis, but the canvas and sketchbook remained, guarded by a young constable whose earnest face reminded her of Tommy Blake, the village lad who had once tripped a rival out of spite. She approached, her smile as warm as a summer hearth, and nodded to the constable. "Good morning, young man," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I wonder if I might take another look at Mr. Harrow's sketchbook. It's such a small thing, but it might hold a memory of the poor boy's work." The constable hesitated, glancing toward Craddock, who was questioning a vendor nearby. Miss Marple's reputation in St. Mary's Mead, however, was a kind of currency, and the constable, with a shy nod, stepped aside. "Just don't touch it, Mum," he said, his tone respectful but firm. Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes already on the sketchbook, which lay open on the grass, its pages curling slightly in the morning breeze. The scrawl she had noted yesterday, the distorted face, the word betrayed, was still there, but under the clearer light, she saw details she had missed. The face, though jagged, had distinct features: high cheekbones, a sharp nose, a mouth twisted in fury. It was unmistakably female, and the ink, she noted, was fresher than the surrounding pages, as if drawn in haste. Beside the word betrayed, a faint smudge suggested a hurried hand, perhaps trembling with emotion or guilt. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The sketch was no idle doodle. It was a message, intentional or not. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, who had scribbled a frantic note before her sister's poisoning, its words a clue to a betrayal that had festered for years. Was this Julian's work, naming his betrayer? Or had someone else, Marcus perhaps, or even Evelyn, planted it to mislead? She recalled Mrs. Finch, whose forged letter had deflected suspicion after a theft, its cleverness undone by a single careless detail. The smudge, she thought, might be such a detail, a thread to tug later. She straightened, thanking the constable with a smile, and let her gaze sweep the fair. Clara Wentworth was near her tent, her clipboard a constant companion, her smile strained as she greeted early visitors. Rupert Langley, his green tie as loud as ever, lingered at a nearby stall, his eyes darting toward Julian's canvas with a hunger that belied his casual air. Evelyn Price, her gloves still conspicuous, stood apart, her notebook open as she scribbled with a ferocity that suggested more than critique. And Marcus Tate, at his own stall, arranged his muted landscapes with a scowl, his isolation palpable. Miss Marple's mind turned to the tray, the poison, the missing waiter. Tommy Gibbs, she knew, was a key, and his absence nagged at her like a dropped stitch. She made her way to the refreshment tent, where a new waiter, a girl from the village, Betsy Cole, served tea with nervous hands. Miss Marple ordered a cup, settling at a table with a view of the fair. "Such a sad business yesterday," she said, her tone gentle, inviting Betsy to linger. "You must know Tommy Gibbs, the lad who carried the champagne tray. Is he not working today?" Betsy's cheeks flushed, and she glanced around before leaning closer. "Tommy's not here, Miss Marple," she whispered. "He ran off after Mr." Harrow fell, said he was scared, didn't want to be blamed. His mum's worried sick, says he's hiding at home, or maybe gone to his cousin in Danemouth. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the loyalty in it, the kind that protected a friend. She thought of Mrs. Gibbs, Tommy's mother, whose nervous doting had often shielded her son's mischief. Had Tommy fled in fear, or was he hiding something darker? "Thank you, Betsy," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. "You've been most helpful." As the girl moved away, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the new thread into the pattern. Tommy's flight suggested guilt, but of what? A boy like him, prone to petty thefts, apples from Mrs. Norton's orchard, a shilling from a church plate, was unlikely to procure cyanide on his own. Yet he had carried the tray, handled the glasses, and vanished when the scream rang out. Was he a pawn, bribed or coerced by another? Clara, who had hired him, came to mind, her ambition a possible motive for using a naive lad. Or perhaps Marcus, whose brooding resentment might have found a tool in Tommy's waywardness. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the sketchbook. The face, so angrily drawn, could belong to Clara, with her sharp features and auburn hair, or Evelyn, whose hawkish profile fit the lines. Or it might be another, a lover, a confidant, someone yet unseen. The word betrayed suggested a personal wound, not merely professional. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when Miss Elwood's lover had poisoned her tea after she spurned him for another, his rage etched in a letter found too late. Julian, with his charm and rising fame, might have broken a heart as easily as he broke convention with his art. She rose, her shawl adjusted, and made her way toward Clara's tent, hoping to glimpse the ledger she had noted yesterday. Clara was absent, likely with Craddock, but the tent was open, its desk a clutter of papers. Miss Marple, with the discretion of one who had navigated many a village intrigue, glanced at the ledger, half hidden under a stack of flyers. A quick scan revealed columns of figures, debts, payments, names. One entry caught her eye, a sum paid to T. Gibbs for services. It was small, but recent, dated the day before the fair. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A payment to Tommy, perhaps for his work, or something more. She thought of Mrs. Carver, whose accounts had revealed a bribe to a delivery boy, a small sum that hid a larger crime. Stepping back into the fair, Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. The sketchbook's clue, Tommy's flight, Clara's ledger, each was a stitch in the tapestry. Suspect's motives wove through her mind. Clara's ambition, Langley's greed, Evelyn's pride, Marcus's envy. Each had been near the tray. Each had a reason to resent Julian, but the why, the spark that turned resentment to murder, remained elusive. She thought of the scrawled face again, its fury a mirror to the killer's heart. Someone had felt betrayed, deeply, personally, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, knew that truth, like a skein of wool, would unravel with the right tug. As she passed Marcus's stall, his eyes met hers, dark and guarded, and she sensed the weight of his unspoken pain. Evelyn, scribbling nearby, glanced up, her gloved hands a silent question. Langley's laughter rang out, too loud, and Clara's clipboard flashed as she returned to her tent. The fair, for all its beauty, was a stage for darker passions, and Miss Marple, her needles still in her bag, was ready to find the thread that bound them all. Chapter 9. The Critic's Secret the Saint. Mary's Mead Art Fair, on its second day, bore the weight of tragedy like a cloak, its tent standing resolute under a sky now clouded with the threat of rain. The village green, though still dotted with curious visitors, lacked the exuberance of the previous morning, the air heavy with whispers of poison and betrayal. Julian Harrow's stall, cordoned off with its canvas shrouded, was a silent monument to the crime, drawing furtive glances from those who passed. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar companion, sat in the parlour of Mrs. Bantry's cottage, a short walk from the fair. The invitation for tea had been a pretext, for Miss Marple had a specific purpose: to probe Evelyn Price, the sharp-tongued critic, whose venom seemed to cut deeper than her reviews. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for a mystery, had arranged the meeting, her parlour a cosy stage for Miss Marple's quiet inquisition. The room was warm, its chintz curtains drawn back to let in the grey light, the fire crackling softly in the grate. A tray of tea and scones sat on the table, the porcelain cups delicate but unyielding, much like Miss Marple herself. Evelyn Price sat across from her, her angular frame rigid in a high-backed chair, her black dress as severe as her expression. Her gloved hands, one of Miss Marple's persistent points of curiosity, rested on her lap, the leather gleaming faintly. Mrs. Bantry, bustling with the energy of a born hostessess, poured the tea, her chatter about the fair's turnout a gentle backdrop to Miss Marple's observations. Evelyn's notebook, ever present, lay closed beside her, its pages no doubt filled with barbs that could ruin careers. Miss Marple, her eyes soft but piercing behind her spectacles, noted the critic's tension, the way her fingers twitched as if longing to grip her pen. "Such a dreadful business at the fair," Miss Marple began, her voice as mild as the steam rising from her cup. "Poor Mr. Harrow. His paintings were so vibrant, weren't they? I understand you knew him quite well, Miss Price." Evelyn's lips tightened, a thin line of displeasure. "Knew him? Hardly. I mentored him, briefly, when he was a student. He had potential, I'll grant, but he squandered it on gaudy displays." Her tone was sharp, and Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of personal grievance, like Mrs. Carver's biting remarks about a rival's embroidery, which had masked a deeper wound. She sipped her tea, letting the silence invite more. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the moment, chimed in. "Oh, but Julian was the talk of the fair." Everyone was buzzing about his work. "Surely you saw something in him, Evelyn, to take him under your wing?" Evelyn's eyes flashed, and her gloved hands clenched, the leather creaking faintly. "I saw raw talent," she said, her voice low but edged with bitterness. "But he was ungrateful. I spent months guiding him, introducing him to galleries, refining his technique, and he threw it back in my face. At a London exhibition last spring, he mocked me in front of collectors, called my reviews stale, and my taste outdated. The arrogance!" Her words spilled out, and Miss Marple noted the raw edge of humiliation, a wound that had not healed. She thought of Miss Elwood, whose public slight by a choir rival led to a tampered thermos, the act as much about pride as revenge. "How terribly unkind," Miss Marple murmured, her tone all sympathy, though her mind was alert. "To be so dismissed after all your efforts." It must have stung, especially for someone of your standing. Evelyn's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing. "It was more than unkind. It was betrayal. I gave him my time, my expertise, and he spat on it. He thought he was above criticism, above me. I warned him his ego would be his downfall." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw the spark of something darker. Rage, perhaps, or a need to reclaim her power. She recalled Mrs. Norton, whose public criticism of a neighbour's baking had escalated into a poisoned cake, the act born of a need to restore her authority. Evelyn's gloves, she thought, could have hidden a vial of cyanide, slipped into Julian's glass during a moment's chaos at the fair. Miss Marple set her cup down, her movements deliberate. "And you were near the champagne tray, I believe," she said, her voice so gentle it might have been a passing thought. Such a thoughtful gesture from Miss Wentworth, though so tragic now. Evelyn stiffened, her gloved hands folding tightly in her lap. "I took a glass, like everyone else," she said, her tone defensive. "I was reviewing Marcus Tate's stall when Julian collapsed. I had no reason to linger near him." Her words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way she emphasized Marcus's name, as if casting suspicion elsewhere. She thought of Mrs. Finch, who had pointed fingers at a neighbour to cover her own theft, her innocence a carefully crafted mask. Evelyn's gloves, so out of place in the warm September light, remained a nagging detail. Could they have concealed the act of poisoning? "And what did you make of Marcus's work?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational, as if the question were mere curiosity. "He seems so different from Julian, so restrained." Evelyn's lips curled into a faint sneer. "Marcus is competent but dull. His landscapes lack imagination. He's eaten up with jealousy, always in Julian's shadow. I saw him near the tray, hovering like a vulture. If anyone had reason to harm Julian, it was him." Her voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the ease with which she shifted blame, a tactic as old as the village itself. She recalled Mr. Henshaw, who had denied poisoning a rival's dog while pointing to another neighbour, his denial as flimsy as Evelyn's now. Mrs. Bantry, sensing a lull, offered more tea, her eyes bright with curiosity. "And what about Clara Wentworth?" she asked, her tone innocent. "She put so much into this fair." Julian's collapse must be a blow to her. Evelyn's sneer softened into a smirk. "Clara's a dreamer, betting everything on this fair. Julian was her prize, but he was unpredictable. I heard he was refusing buyers, holding out for bigger offers. That wouldn't have sat well with her. She needed his sales to cover her debts." Her words were laced with relish, and Miss Marple noted the critic's delight in others' misfortunes, a trait she had seen in Mrs. Langley, whose gossip had fueled a village feud. Evelyn's knowledge of Clara's finances, though, was a thread worth tugging. How had she learned of such private matters? "And Mr. Langley, the buyer," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as a whisper. "He seemed quite keen on Julian's work. Did he ever speak to you about it?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she answered readily. "Rupert Langley's a profiteer, nothing more. He wanted Julian's paintings for a song, thought he could cash in on his fame. Julian turned him down flat from what I heard. Langley wasn't pleased." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the calculation in it, the way she wove suspicion around others while guarding her own secrets. She thought of the sketchbook scrawl, "Betrayed," and wondered if Evelyn's mentoring of Julian had held a deeper bond, one broken by his public scorn. Betrayal, she knew, could drive even the proudest heart to extremes. The conversation turned to lighter matters, Mrs. Bantry steering it toward village gossip. But Miss Marple's mind remained on Evelyn. Her wounded pride, her gloved hands, her quickness to implicate Marcus and Clara, all were threads in the tapestry. But the critic's secret lay in that moment of betrayal, that public humiliation. Had it been enough to push her to poison? Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Hartley, whose poisoned tea had avenged a similar slight. Her calm exterior hiding a heart of rage. Evelyn's composure, she suspected, was just such a mask. Rising, Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bantry for the tea, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "And thank you, Miss Price, for indulging an old woman's curiosity," she said. "Your insights are most illuminating." Evelyn nodded, her expression guarded, and returned to her notebook, her pen resuming its sharp dance. Miss Marple stepped into the chilly afternoon, her thoughts racing. The fair stretched before her, its tents now shadowed by clouds. Clara was near her tent, her clipboard a shield, her smile strained. Langley's laughter rang out from a stall, his greed undimmed. Marcus, at his own stall, stared at his paintings with a scowl. And Evelyn's gloves, Miss Marple thought, were a clue as sharp as her pen. The truth was close, hidden in the weave of pride and betrayal, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would find it. Chapter 10. The Buyer's Game. The St. Mary's Mead Art Fair, now in its second day, wore its tragedy like a muted veil, the vibrant tents standing in defiance of the grey clouds gathering overhead. The village green, though still alive with the murmur of visitors, carried a subdued energy, as if the very grass held its breath after Julian Harrow's poisoning. The cordoned-off stall, its canvas now hidden beneath a tarp, drew sidelong glances from passers-by, a silent reminder of the crime that had shattered the fair's glitter. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a steadfast companion, made her way to the village inn, where Rupert Langley had agreed to meet her for a sherry. The inn, with its low beams and polished oak bar, was a haven of warmth against the chilly afternoon, its hearth casting a ruddy glow across the worn tables. Miss Marple, her small figure wrapped in a woolen shawl, settled into a corner booth, her eyes bright with the quiet alertness that had unravelled many a village secret. Rupert Langley entered with the swagger of a man accustomed to command, his portly frame clad in a tweed suit, his garish green tie a jarring note against the inn's muted tones. His ruddy face bore a genial smile, but Miss Marple noted the calculation in his eyes, the way they flickered over her as if assessing her worth. She thought of Mr. Thompson, the village merchant whose hearty laugh had masked a temper that erupted when a deal went awry, leaving a rival's shop window in shards. Langley, she suspected, played a similar game, his wealth a tool for control, his smile a mask for sharper motives. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," Langley said, settling opposite her with a creak of the wooden bench. He signalled for a sherry, his gold watch chain glinting as he moved. "I hear you've a knack for puzzles. This business with Julian is a nasty one, isn't it?" His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the edge in it, a wariness that suggested he knew more than he let on. She smiled, her expression as mild as the sherry the barmaid set before them, and sipped delicately, letting the silence invite candour. "Indeed, Mr. Langley," she said, her voice soft but precise. "Such a tragedy for the fair. I understand you were quite taken with Mr. Harrow's work. His paintings must have been a fine investment." Langley's eyes gleamed, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Oh, they were exceptional. That big abstract, reds and golds, you know, could have fetched a fortune in London. I offered him £20,000, a generous sum for a lad his age. But Julian, stubborn fool, turned me down, said he had a better offer, some gallery type from the city." His smile tightened, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck, a sign of pique she had seen in Mr. Grayson, who had burned a neighbour's haystack after a land deal soured. Rejection, she knew, could wound a man like Langley, whose wealth was both shield and sword. "How disappointing that must have been," she said, her tone all sympathy, though her eyes were sharp. "To have such a prize slip away, especially for a man of your discernment." Langley chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "Disappointing, yes, but it's all part of the game." Julian thought he could play hardball, hold out for more. I told him he was making a mistake, but he wouldn't listen. His fingers toyed with his watch chain, a nervous habit. And Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Hartley, whose fidgeting with a locket had betrayed her guilt after poisoning her husband's sherry. Langley's casual dismissal of Julian's refusal, she suspected, hid a deeper resentment, perhaps deep enough to turn to murder. She let the silence stretch, sipping her sherry, her eyes never leaving his face. "And you were near the champagne tray, I believe," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. Miss Wentworth's gesture was so thoughtful, though so tragic now. Langley's hand stilled, and his smile faltered just for a moment. "I took a glass, yes, like everyone else. Perfectly fine, mind you. I was nowhere near Julian when he went down. I was off looking at another stall. Some dreary landscapes. Marcus Tate's, I think." His words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way he pointed to Marcus, much as Evelyn Price had done. She thought of Mrs. Finch, who had blamed a neighbour for a theft she herself had committed, her lies as smooth as Langley's now. His proximity to the tray, his wealth that could procure cyanide through illicit channels, made him a thread worth tugging. "Marcus Tate's work is quite different, isn't it?" she said, her tone musing, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "So restrained, compared to Julian's boldness." "I imagine their rivalry was quite intense." Langley nodded, his smile returning but less certain. "Oh, Marcus was green with envy. Always skulking about, glaring at Julian's crowds. If anyone had a reason to slip something into that glass, it was him. Or that critic, Evelyn Price. She had it in for Julian, you know. Wrote a scathing review last month, called his work tasteless. And Clara Wentworth, well, she was banking on Julian to save her fare. His antics weren't helping her debts." His voice was breezy, but Miss Marple caught the calculation in it, the way he wove suspicion around others while guarding his own secrets. She recalled Mr. Henshaw, who had deflected blame for a poisoned dog by pointing to a rival, his charm a mask for malice. And yet, Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but searching, Julian's paintings must be worth even more now, with all of this talk. A tragedy like this can stir interest, can't it? Langley's eyes narrowed, but he laughed, a hearty sound that rang false. "A grim truth, Miss Marple. Collectors are already sniffing around, hoping to snap up his work before the prices soar. I might make another offer myself, if his family's willing." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted the hunger in his gaze, the same gleam she had seen when he lingered near Julian's stall. She thought of Mr. Carver, who had bought a rival's land after a suspicious fire, his sympathy as hollow as Langley's now. Could he have poisoned Julian to inflate the value of his art, or to punish a refusal that stung his pride? She shifted, her shawl slipping slightly, and changed tack. "You must meet so many interesting people in your dealings," she said, her voice warm with curiosity. "Miss Wentworth, for instance, she seems so dedicated." And Miss Price, with her sharp pen. "Did they ever speak of Julian in your conversations?" Langley shrugged, but his eyes flicked away, a telltale sign. Clara was always singing Julian's praises, needed his sales to keep her fare afloat. Evelyn, though, couldn't stand him. Said he mocked her in public, made a fool of her. I'd wager she's not shedding tears over his collapse. His words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the ease with which he shifted blame, a tactic she had seen in Mrs. Norton, whose gossip had deflected suspicion from her own tampered lemonade. Langley's knowledge of Evelyn's grudge, though, was a thread to follow. How closely had he watched the fair's players? Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her smile as warm as the inn's hearth. "You've been most kind, Mr. Langley," she said. Your insights are most helpful for an old woman trying to understand such a dreadful affair." He tipped his hat, his expression genial but guarded, and Miss Marple stepped out into the gathering dusk, her thoughts racing. The fair lay quiet, its tents dark against the grey sky. Clara Wentworth was near her tent, her clipboard a shield, her smile strained. Evelyn Price, her gloves still on, scribbled in her notebook, her back to the cordoned-off stall. Marcus Tate, at his stall, stared at his paintings with a scowl. And Langley, now lingering at the bar, his laughter ringing out, seemed untouched by the tragedy. Miss Marple's mind turned to the sketchbook scrawl, "Betrayed." Had Julian betrayed Langley by refusing his offer? Or was the betrayal a deeper wound, one Langley's charm concealed? His wealth, his proximity to the tray, his quickness to implicate others, all were threads in the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet clear. She thought of Mrs. Hartley again, whose poisoned sherry had avenged a betrayal, her calm exterior hiding a heart of rage. Langley's game, she suspected, was one of greed and pride, but whether it led to murder remained to be seen. The truth, as always, lay in the quiet spaces between words, and Miss Marple, with her patient stitching, would find it. Chapter 11. The Organiser's Burden, the Saint. Mary's Mead Art Fair on its third morning stirred under a sky heavy with clouds, the threat of rain lending a restless edge to the village green. The tents, though still standing proud, seemed to huddle together, their canvas flaps trembling in the fitful breeze. Julian Harrow's stall, cordoned off and shrouded, remained a grim focal point, its silence louder than the murmurs of the diminished crowd. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved through the fair with the quiet purpose of one who sees beyond the surface. Her destination was Clara Wentworth's tent, the nerve centre of the fair, where the organiser's polished exterior masked a burden Miss Marple was determined to uncover. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp grass and the faint tang of turpentine from nearby stalls, and Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted every detail. The nervous glances of artists, the cautious steps of buyers, the constable's vigilant watch over the crime scene. Clara's tent, marked by its neat bunting and a sign proclaiming fair headquarters, was a hive of activity, though subdued by the shadow of Julian's poisoning. Clara herself stood at her desk, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her navy suit as pristine as ever. But Miss Marple caught the strain in her posture, the way her manicured hands gripped her clipboard. The faint lines of worry etched around her hazel eyes. A tray of tea and biscuits sat untouched on a side table, the marigolds in their vase wilting slightly, as if mirroring the fair's faltering spirit. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm, but her gaze searching like a grandmother probing a child's half-truth. "Miss Wentworth," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you've done wonders with the fair, despite such a dreadful turn. It must be quite a burden to carry on." Clara looked up, her smile flickering like a candle in a draught. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to say," she replied, her voice practised but tinged with fatigue. "It's been challenging, but the show must go on, mustn't it?" She gestured to a folding chair, and Miss Marple sat, her knitting bag resting on her lap, though her needles remained still. She thought of Mrs. Finch, whose flawless hosting of a village auction had concealed a desperate bid to cover debts, her charm a mask for calculation. Clara's composure, Miss Marple suspected, hid a similar strain, one tied to the fair's success, or its failure. They sipped tea, the porcelain cups clinking softly, and Miss Marple let the silence work its magic. "Julian Harrow's work was such a draw," she said at last, her tone gentle. "I imagine his success was vital to the fair's prospects." It must have been a shock to see him collapse. Clara's fingers tightened on her clipboard, a faint tremor betraying her. "A shock, yes," she said, her voice low. "Julian was our star. His paintings brought in buyers, critics, even that dreadful Evelyn Price. Without him—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to the tent's open flap, where the cordoned-off stall was just visible. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Clara's gaze lingered on the ropes, as if they marked not just a crime, but a personal loss. She recalled Mrs. Eldridge, who had sabotaged a rival's roses to save her own reputation, her desperation cloaked in a smile. Could Clara, with her loans and ambitions, have seen Julian's collapse as a twisted salvation? "You put so much into this fair," Miss Marple said, her voice all sympathy. "I heard from Mrs. Gibbs at the shop that you'd taken great risks to make it happen. It must weigh heavily with such a tragedy now." Clara's smile faltered, and for a moment her guard slipped. "It's no secret," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I borrowed heavily to fund the fair, against my home even. Julian's sales were meant to cover it all. If he'd sold that big canvas to Langley, or anyone, I'd have been safe. But he kept holding out, saying he wanted more, always more." Her words carried a mix of frustration and despair, and Miss Marple's mind quickened. She thought of Mrs. Norton, who had tampered with a rival's lemonade to ensure her own triumph at a garden party, her desperation driving her to ruin another. Clara's financial peril, tied to Julian's whims, was a motive as sharp as cyanide. "And the champagne tray," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as a passing thought. "You poured it yourself, I believe." Such a generous gesture. Though so tragic now, Clara's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly, her smile returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Yes, I poured from a single bottle, a little tradition to toast the fair's opening. Tommy Gibbs carried the tray. He's a local lad, you know, reliable for small tasks. I can't imagine how anything went wrong." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the nervous glance toward her clipboard, the way her fingers traced its edges. She recalled Mr. Grayson, who had claimed ignorance when his rival's wine was poisoned, his calm a mask for complicity. Clara's role in the tray's journey, her hiring of Tommy, suggested either carelessness or cunning. Tommy Gibbs, Miss Marple mused, as if the name were new to her. "I recall him from the village, such a lively boy. You chose him specially, did you?" Clara hesitated, her fingers stilling. "His mother recommended him," she said, her tone careful. "Mrs. Gibbs said he needed work, and I needed an extra pair of hands. He was only meant to carry the tray, nothing more." Her words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the defensiveness, the way she distanced herself from Tommy's absence. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, who had used a gullible nephew to deliver a poisoned teacup, her instructions vague but deadly. Had Clara orchestrated a similar act, or was Tommy a convenient scapegoat for her own hand? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but searching. And the others, Mr. Langley, Miss Price, Mr. Tate, they were all near the tray, weren't they? It must be so difficult, managing such a crowd. Clara nodded, her composure returning. Oh yes, it was chaos. Langley was hovering, as was always, sniffing out a deal. Evelyn was scribbling her nasty little notes, gloves and all. And Marcus, well, he was practically glued to Julian's stall, glaring like a storm cloud. Any of them could have. She stopped, her eyes widening as if she'd said too much. And Miss Marple noted the slip, the way she cast suspicion wide to avoid scrutiny. She recalled Mrs. Langley, whose gossip had deflected blame from her own forged letter. Her words a net to ensnare others. Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her shawl, her smile as warm as the tent's dim light. "You've been most kind, Miss Wentworth," she said. "It can't be easy, carrying such a burden through this ordeal." Clara nodded, her smile strained, and returned to her clipboard, her fingers flipping pages with a restless energy. Miss Marple stepped out into the fair, the air now damp with the promise of rain. The green stretched before her, its tents shadowed by clouds. Rupert Langley, his green tie a beacon, laughed at a nearby stall, his greed undimmed. Evelyn Price, her gloves still on, scribbled in her notebook, her back to the cordoned-off stall. Marcus Tate, at his own stall, stared at his paintings with a scowl, his hands clenched. Miss Marple's mind turned to the sketchbook scrawl, betrayed. Had Julian betrayed Clara by refusing to sell, jeoparding her desperation into something deadly? Her financial strain, her control of the tray, her hiring of Tommy, all were threads in the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet whole. She thought of the face in the sketchbook, its female fury. Could it be Clara, her ambition twisted into rage? Or was it a misdirection, like Mrs. Finch's forged letter, meant to confuse? The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the quiet spaces between actions. And she would find it, stitch by careful stitch, as the fair's secrets unravelled under her watchful gaze. Chapter 12. The Rival's Confession the Saint. Mary's Mead. Art Fair, on its final evening, lay cloaked in a sombre dusk, the tents casting long shadows across the village green. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, and the few remaining visitors moved with hurried steps, as if eager to escape the weight of the tragedy that had marked the event. Julian Harrow's stall, still cordoned off, stood like a silent sentinel, its tarp-shrouded canvas a mute testament to the poison that had struck its creator. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, lingered near Marcus Tate's stall, her small figure blending into the twilight as she observed the young artist. The fair was winding down, but Miss Marple's work was far from over, her mind weaving the final threads of a tapestry that had begun to reveal its pattern. Marcus Tate stood alone, his brooding figure hunched over a muted landscape, its greens and browns fading into the evening light. His hands, usually steady with a brush, were restless, twisting a rag as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple had noted his presence throughout the fair, his sullen glances at Julian's stall, his proximity to the champagne tray, his evasive answers about their shared past. The sketchbook scrawl, betrayed, with its distorted female face, had haunted her, suggesting a motive deeper than professional rivalry. She thought of Mrs. Norton, whose envy of a neighbour's garden had masked a personal betrayal, a stolen love that drove her to poison. Marcus's bitterness, she suspected, held a similar secret, one she was determined to uncover. She approached, her steps soft on the damp grass, her smile as gentle as the fading light. "Mr. Tate," she said, her voice a quiet invitation. "Your paintings have such a quiet beauty. It's a shame the fair's been overshadowed by such a dreadful event." She paused before a canvas of a misty moor, her eyes soft but searching, like a grandmother coaxing a reluctant confession. Marcus looked up, his dark eyes wary, his jaw tight. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Not much beauty left in this fair, is there?" Julian saw to that. Even now his words were sharp, and Miss Marple noted the raw edge of resentment, a fire that had not dimmed despite Julian's collapse. She thought of young Tommy Blake, whose envy of a rival racer had led to a deliberate trip, his anger a mirror to Marcus's now. She settled onto a folding chair beside the stall, gesturing for him to join her, knowing that shared moments often loosened guarded tongues. "You and Mr. Harrow were friends once, I believe," she said, her tone conversational. "It must be painful to see such a friend struck down." Marcus sat, his hands still twisting the rag, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Friends," he said bitterly. "That was a long time ago. Julian changed, got too big for a zid, boots took everything that mattered." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She recalled his earlier pause, his hint that Julian had taken everything, and the sketchbook's word, betrayed. Was it more than fame or success? She thought of Mrs. Hartley, whose poisoned tea had avenged a stolen love, her quiet demeanour hiding a heart of rage. "Everything?" she prompted, her voice as soft as a whisper, inviting confession without demand. "It sounds as though he hurt you deeply, mister." Tate Marcus's hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he might retreat. Then he spoke, his voice barely audible, a confession spilling like water from a cracked dam. "Laura," he said, his eyes dark with pain, "she was my fiancée last year. We were going to marry after the fair season. But Julian, he charmed her, took her away. She left me for him, said he was her future." His words were raw, and Miss Marple's mind raced to the sketchbook's face. Female, furious, distorted. Was it Laura, drawn in Marcus's rage, or Julian's fear? She recalled Mrs. Eldridge, whose sabotage of a rival's roses had stemmed from a similar betrayal. Her heart broken by a lost love. "How terribly cruel," Miss Marple said, her tone all sympathy, though her eyes were sharp. "To lose someone so dear, and to see him triumph here, it must have been unbearable." Marcus's jaw clenched, and he looked away, toward Julian's stall, where the tarp fluttered in the breeze. "Unbearable," he echoed. "Every time I saw him, grinning, soaking up the crowds, it was like a knife." And Laura, she was there, at his stall, before he collapsed. I saw her laughing with him. His voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the intensity, the way his hands shook as he spoke. She thought of the champagne tray, Marcus's lingering presence, his hands in his pockets that could have held a vial of cyanide, procured perhaps from an art school contact skilled in chemistry. "The champagne tray," she said, her voice as light as a passing thought. "You were near it, weren't you?" Such a tragic moment. That toast Marcus's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of panic in their depths. "I didn't drink," he said quickly. I was just watching." Everyone was near the tray. Clara, Langley, Evelyn. It was chaos. His words were defensive, and Miss Marple noted the lie, subtle but present. She had seen him closer to Julian's stall, his posture tense, his hands hidden. She recalled Mr. Grayson, who had denied tampering with a rival's wine, his denial as flimsy as Marcus's now. She leaned forward, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Mr. Tate," she said, her voice a gentle probe, "that sketchbook, with its drawing and the word betrayed. It was so unlike Julian's work. Could it have been yours, perhaps? A moment of anger." Marcus flinched, his face paling. "No," he said, but his voice faltered. I saw the sketchbook, but it wasn't mine." His denial was weak, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the face in the sketch. Laura, perhaps, drawn in fury by Marcus, or planted to mislead. She thought of Mrs. Finch, whose forged letter had deflected suspicion after a theft, her cunning as sharp as Marcus's resentment seemed now. The air grew heavier, the first drops of rain pattering on the tent above. Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone as kind as a grandmother's. "You loved her, didn't you?" And Julian took her, just as he took the fair's light. It would be only human, Mr. Tate, to want to stop him. Marcus's shoulders slumped, and his eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met hers. "I couldn't stand it," he whispered. "I got the cyanide from a friend, a chemist from school. I just wanted him gone, out of my way. I slipped it into his glass when the tray passed by. No one saw his voice broke, and Miss Marple sighed, her heart heavy with the weight of human frailty. She thought of young Tommy Blake again, his childish spite grown deadly in Marcus's hands. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You must tell Inspector Craddock, my dear," she said softly. "It's the only way." Marcus nodded, his face a mask of defeat, and Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. She signalled to a nearby constable, who escorted Marcus away as the rain began to fall in earnest. The fair was nearly empty now, its tents dark against the wet green. Clara Wentworth stood under her canopy, her clipboard abandoned, her face pale. Rupert Langley, his green tie sodden, hurried toward the village inn. Evelyn Price, her gloves still on, packed her notebook away, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, returned to her cottage, the fire waiting. As she sat, her needles clicking softly, she mused on envy's poison, deadlier than any chemical. The truth, as always, had emerged in the quiet spaces. And Saint. Mary's mead was safe once more.